second-term Lok Sabha MP from Thiruvananthapuram, our own town. He is a previous Minister of State in the Government of India. He has served as the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations also. Dr. Tharoor is an award-winning author of works of both fiction and non-fiction, with his latest being Why I Am a Hindu. He has written hundreds of articles and book reviews in a wide range of publications, including the New York Times and Washington Post, and hugely popular, as you can see now, on social media platforms, an excellent orator, which you will hear and experience just in a moment. Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Neeti, for that generous introduction. And thank you all for this amazing turnout. I must say, I turned up at the festival hall, as I was told to, after 4 completely unrelated functions outside in the city, and discovered a largely empty audience. And I said, clearly, everybody heard me this morning and they're not coming back. And then an anxious organizer runs up and says, no, we've shifted you to Nishagandhi. There was no room for the people. So thank you all very much for having turned up in such large numbers. So the topic that the organizers dreamt up for me is Hinduism, history, and the national identity. And the first question then came to my mind is, does one take each of these separately and try to relate them, or does one actually just speak about the whole thing together? Because in fact, in a curious way, Hinduism is not terribly good at history. Because Hinduism, as you all know, does not have a linear view of time. In Hindu thought and philosophy, the world, let's paraphrase Eliot, time past and time future is contained in time present. And the world goes through these endless cycles, these yugas, in which one yuga gives way to the next. And once you have the 4 yugas done, you have this terrible big flood, this major destruction, and the whole cycle starts again. So, is there any meaning to history in the conventional sense within Hinduism? But then I realized that what the organizers really had in mind was for me to take up the issue of how history is sought to be rethought and reinvented by the advocates, not so much of Hinduism, but of what is called Hindutva. Because this has now become a matter of some contention in our contemporary politics. And so when one looks at issues of national identity through the prism of our contemporary politics, one comes squarely against a fundamental question: what makes up the national identity of this country? Now, to many of you in Kerala, the answer may seem obvious. To some in other parts of the country avidly caught up in debating these issues, there is another answer. And I'm going to take a little bit of your time in trying to lay out these competing visions, both of which in their own ways are anchored, yes, in ideas of Hinduism, and also, yes, in ideas of history. Now, when we came to independence in 1947, we won independence as the culmination of a long struggle in which there was a central argument about national identity. As we all know, the British from 1857 had embarked on a systematic policy of divide and rule. Their logic was very simple. Having seen in the Great Revolt of 1857, which they tried to dismiss as the Sepoy Mutiny, Hindus and Muslim soldiers fighting side by side and under each other's command, under the banner of the enfeebled Mughal emperor, to throw out the hated foreign oppressor, the British said this must never be allowed to happen again. I'd like some water. And so Lord Elphinstone, in fact, wrote a celebrated or notorious memorandum, thank you, in which he said, divide et impera is the old Roman maxim and it shall be ours. Divide et impera, of course, was Latin for divide and rule. And the way they saw the way forward for the British colonial enterprise to divide opposition to it was by fomenting separate religious consciousness amongst the two major religions of the country, Hinduism and Islam. And since Hindus were a majority, the British decided to turn their attention to Islam and to encourage separate and, as they saw it, loyalist Muslim sentiment. And this went ranging from some relatively benign actions like the founding of the Anglo-Mohammedan College by Sir Syed Ahmed Khan in Aligarh in the 1880s, to some not so benign methods, such as the founding of the Muslim League as an alternative to the Indian National Congress and the British role in the partition of Bengal. I don't want to detain you too long in history, but let me give you a little more about both those. The Indian National Congress was founded in 1885 by a liberal-minded Scotsman, Alan Octavian Hume, with a view to creating a representative body of all Indian communities, essentially to decorously petition the British to grant Indians the rights of Englishmen. And it was not a particularly hostile body to British rule at the beginning. On the contrary, it was full of Anglophile lawyers who literally wrote these petitions, which the British, without much ceremony, filed vertically in the waste paper basket. Now, when this was going on, had the British been even a fraction sincere in their professions of determination to move India towards progressively responsible self-government, they would clearly have co-opted the Indian National Congress as the sort of steam valve on top of the pressure cooker, the body that could be relied upon to be a sufficiently pro-English establishment ready to exercise government powers on behalf of the Indians, but at the same time without fundamentally challenging the interests of the British. As for the representative quality of the Indian National Congress, just look at the names of the presidents in the first 20 years. You find not just Hindus, you find Christians, Muslims, and Parsis all presiding over the Indian National Congress in its first couple of decades, and even a couple of white people who came from Britain but subscribed to the goals that I have just outlined to you. But did the British do what I've suggested would have been in their interest had they been sincere? No, because they were not sincere. They had no desire to see the rise of a truly representative Indian body. And so what they did was, rather than co-opt this body, they encouraged the foundation of a rival body organized on religious lines, the All India Muslim League. Similarly, Bengal was a province that was roughly half Hindu and half Muslim. And they thought that the fact that Bengal was functioning as one province militated against the principle of divide and rule. And so a conscious decision was taken by Lord Curzon to divide Bengal in order to create an overwhelmingly Muslim province in the east. And it was sold to the Muslim population of East Bengal on those terms. In fact, Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, Bamphil Fuller, in a notorious speech said, "We English are like a man with two wives, one Hindu, one Muslim, and we much prefer the Muslim wife." And it was very much to send the signal that Britain was acting in the interests of Muslim Bengalis. But when they tried to sell this idea to the principal Muslim nobleman of Bengal, the Nawab of Dhaka, who was an Oxford-educated, very English sort of chap, he said, "What a beastly idea." He said, "I certainly shan't hear another word about it." Now, the hostility of the top Muslim nobleman was not going to be helpful, so the British quietly slipped him £100,000, and thereupon he changed his tune. And indeed, the partition of Bengal followed. It then gave rise to riots and demonstrations and had to be undone. But it's an indication of how the British were constantly trying to create a separate consciousness. When from 1906 onwards, they very reluctantly gave a very limited vote to Indians. First in the Minto-Morley reforms, and after the First World War, belatedly in the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. And these were very limited. Only 1 out of every 250 Indians could vote. So it was a very, very small franchise just for the elite. Even there, they drew up separate constituency lists for people of different religions, so that Muslim voters would vote for Muslim candidates, Christian voters for Christian candidates, once again to create separate consciousness. The Indian National Congress, to its credit, resolutely insisted on standing for all of India's communities. And it refused to fall into the logic of the British approach. With the result, there were Indian National Congress candidates for the so-called general seats, but there were also Indian National Congress candidates for the Muslim seats, for the Christian seats, for the Sikh seats, and so on. Now, it's important to stress this element of history because the rise of the Muslim League and the promotion of the idea that there were two nations within India and that the Muslims were a separate nation would not have occurred without this very conscious British policy to create such a sense of separate identity. And having done that, the idea that the Muslims were a separate nation took hold, but not with the Muslim people, only with the elite supported by the British, so that when in 1936 the first more or less free elections with a mass electorate took place under the Government of India Act 1936, which in fact resulted in elections mainly in 36-37, the Muslim League, arguing that Muslims were separate, could not even win a significant number of seats in the Muslim-reserved constituencies. They actually found their separatist message had no traction with the Muslim electorate, and the Muslim seats were won predominantly in the first place by the Unionist Party in the Punjab, which had both Hindus and Muslims in it, and some Sikhs. Secondly, by the Krishak Mazdoor Praja Party in Bengal, which was a farmers' and peasants' party, again with Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists in it, headed by a Muslim. Third, by the Indian National Congress, and only fourth by the All India Muslim League. So the Muslim League's separatist project, the idea of a separate national identity, was actually faltering as late as 1937-38, when the Indian National Congress formed the government in 7 provinces, the Unionists in 1, Punjab, and the KMPP, the Krishak Mazdoor Praja Party, in 1, Bengal. But then fortune fell in the laps of the British and the Muslim League, because in 1939, the Second World War broke out, and the Viceroy, the rather plodding and unimaginative Lord Linlithgow, declared war on behalf of India without consulting a single elected Indian leader. And at this point, the Indian National Congress, which had been anti-fascist well before the British had been anti-fascist, Nehru had spent 9 hours in an airport in Rome rather than accept an invitation to meet the dictator Mussolini, so strongly ideologically was he opposed to fascism. The Congress would have supported a war against fascism, but not with the British declaring on behalf of India, and so they resigned all their seats to which they had been elected and resigned the provincial governments. This was a complete boon to the British and the Muslim League, because the British promptly proceeded to appoint unelected Muslim Leaguers to the positions vacated by the elected congressmen. The Muslim League was able to use the patronage and power of office to distribute patronage and pelf to people, to collect followers and support and to increase their coffers. with the result that the Muslim League went from merely 20 lakh members before the Second World War to 20 million or 2 crore by the end of it. It was an extraordinary growth facilitated by the opportunities given by the British, and indeed the